Hi everyone! I just wanted to keep you up to date with some of the projects that I have currently on the go. And one of them is particularly exciting to me. One of the areas of research, and definitely of my great interest, that I have been focusing on recently is the relationship that there is between glucose, inflammation, monitored via heart rate variability. So one of the things that I wanted to actually see is I understand that we can do little checks of glucose via blood, but what about if we would be able to monitor constantly the glucose level rather than either a finger prick at specific time during the day, or fasting in the morning, or before and after dinner or lunch? What about if we could measure also heart rate variability in the same manner? And this is exactly what we're going to cover today. So looking at our mini agenda, is a very short video today just to keep you guys up to date. What is heart rate variability, and a little case study. So we know that heart rate variability is the measurement of the variations between the time gaps of heart rate. So let's assume a heart rate beats at 60 beats per minute. A regular beat normally is not a terribly good sign. Normally a well-rested heart tends to have substantial variation between different beats. And this is really important. Imagine the heartbeat like a rubber band. So if the rubber band is relaxed, then has a lot more ability to expand and contract again. Whereas if the rubber band is already stretched, then the variations in the changes in length can actually be very modest. So the heartbeat is normally controlled by a sympathetic activation, inflammatory response, electrical impulses. So we tend to use HRV, so heart rate variability, as a measurement for parasympathetic and sympathetic balance, i.e. sympathetic activation. Parasympathetic normally be down to a lack of sympathetic activation. There are ways of mildly stimulating the vagus nerve, therefore increasing parasympathetic response, but we don't want to artificially change the heart rate variability. I tend to use heart rate variability as a great sign to guide me, for example, with my training. There are numerous applications for heart rate variability. So looking at heart rate variability, when the heart is well rested and there is low degree of inflammatory response, the variation between the beats is wider, is bigger. And there are mainly two types of measurements. So the first one is when the body is at rest, to determine a baseline, and this can be done with many different apps in reasonably inexpensive manner, between 60 and 120 seconds a day. So I tend to measure mine first thing in the morning, trying to maintain variables as constant as possible. So for example, I have a certain routine. I wake up, I drink some water, pop to the restroom, come back, relax for 10 minutes, meditate or breathe, whatever, and then I take my heart rate variability. That is exactly, for my case, I want to measure both lying down and standing, so it's twice as long and is 120 seconds. You can use a heart monitor, or normally people tend to use a Polar H7, which you can purchase online. Normally in cycle shops is a lot cheaper. Or you can also use the camera of the phone or a sensor, depending upon which app you're going to use. I will post a video purely on the toolkit that I found to be one of the most successful. The other type of measurement can be a specific time in order to measure how the environment is influencing the performance and physiology. And this can either be before and after, still with a 60 seconds, or can be 24-hour ongoing with, I tend to use a kit called first beat, all one word, from a company called Optima Health. So this is a graph of the heartbeat, and the heartbeat has two main domains. One is time, which we already mentioned, and the other one are the electrical impulses, also known as frequencies. However, what I wanted to cover today is purely looking at the variation there could be between the heart rate variability, i.e. sympathetic activation and inflammatory response, and glucose level. And I wanted to see if there was a correlation. So these are two graphs one on another of the heart rate variability measure and the glucose. So let's start with the greens and reds. So the green is when the dominant side of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic, whereas the red one is when the sympathetic takes over. All going to light blue, where the small gaps in light blue that I was either walking very briskly or the body started to perceive some form of physical activity. And the darker blue, if you see towards the end of the day, normally at this level here, you normally know that your heart rate started to increase decently. The actual glucose level is the line that goes across all the graph, which is blue and red. And so you have a low line, which is the blue very close to the bottom of the graph, and which is at this level, kind of halfway through the actual slide. And slightly above that, cutting across the green, you have this thicker line that is going through. And interestingly enough, the correlation I started to notice is, in my opinion, quite substantial to notice, because if we see when we have a substantial rest period, so the green area, we can see that the line is either reasonably stable and also lower compared to the average of that line. I have all the data separately in numbers, and therefore I'm able to say this. So starting from the far left, that is the 12 o'clock. So the first green, good green block interrupted by a little red, that is my sleep. And as you can see, that area of the graph, the blue line with the red dips, is reasonably and substantially lower than the rest of the day, which is normally, if you look between half, you can just about see the number underneath. So there is an 8 o'clock, and there is a 9 o'clock, and then there is a 10 o'clock. And this is when my day will start. So I start by having, in this case, I had a cold shower where I had the biggest parasympathetic activation, then followed by moving around, having breakfast, and etc., and then taking the dogs for a walk. And as you can see, as soon as my body starts to have stimulus from the environment, you can see that the glucose level starts to go up on average, but in addition to that, starts to flicker back and forth. So, well, up and down more than back and forth. And then if you noticed, when I was relaxing, which is the last of the green blocks, if you can spot the 6.6 number at the time, you can actually see that by the end of that period of relaxation, my glucose has substantially dropped all the way down to reach 4.2. This I find very, very interesting, because the variation in the glucose, they are not immediate. So we can account for probably between 30 to 45 to 60 minutes delay as a reflection on the glucose of sympathetic activation or lack of, and inflammatory response. I have other data that would also look at, for example, inflammatory response. So when I had a strong training sessions, inflammation that has generated inflammatory response, and post-training the glucose drops substantially, but as the inflammation carries on, we are starting to observe that the glucose level will start to raise. And this is, I think, is really interesting topic, because if people want to use exercise in order to reduce their insulin resistance and therefore having a lower baseline for glucose, maybe they should do more specific targeted type of exercise rather than train as hard as they possibly can. We do want to stimulate glut transporters and allow the body to become more efficient in shifting glucose into the blood cell. But as we know, if we rely on insulin to try to clear the glucose from the blood, we kind of know that we are already in trouble. This is a statement according to Mike Julian, a kind of colleague, acquaintance of mine on my Facebook page. So this to me is great. Is kind of stating the obvious, because we know the inflammatory response and inflammatory response and sympathetic activation will have an effect, but I have not measured this before using two 24-hour recording devices. One, which is a sensor implanted in my skin to measure the glucose, and two, a portable ECG equipment that attaches to my heart at high degree of precision. And as looking at this graph, we could use this, especially with if you're dealing with patients, this could be an impressive tool to use with them, because it can actually show them that when they have sympathetic activation going from a deadline or rushing for something or an argument or whatever that may be, we know that that can potentially have a substantial negative effect in their glucose level. And if someone stays at a specific level for prolonged time and or has a chronic inflammatory response, then obviously these are all things predisposing the person or worsening a type 2 diabetic predisposition or even expression. Conclusion. Accounting for a delayed response that we have, we can see a pattern where HRV changes driven by either inflammation or sympathetic activation affect glucose level. There is a delay between 30 and 60 minutes. What is interesting to notice at this moment in time is that when we are in a parasympathetic, as you saw in the graph, the green part, the glucose is also more stable and lower. Whereas if we look, when we have a sympathetic activation, even if it's a mild dominance, so where the graph was actually mildly red, not big chunk of red, the glucose, one, goes up, which is totally normal, I understand, and two, starts to actually be more erratic. And this is what can potentially also cause a problem, because that can also lead to different behavior from the person, going from psycho-emotional to physiological. So this is where potentially craving could generate problems in people's habit, and also having damages to glycation and HbA1c increase. I'm collecting more data as we speak. I already have other 3 full days comparable. So far, very consistent. I'm just waiting for extra data to come in, and I will present shortly, hopefully, a little bit more information about this. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it.